Hello, I'm Martijn Graat and this is Does Logistics Matter? A podcast on trends and innovations in supply chain and logistics. Answering yes to the question today is Lora Cecere, also known as the supply chain shaman and founder of Supply Chain Insights. In this episode, we talk about the 5 types of supply chains, what having an excellent supply chain actually means, and how the future of supply chain is outside in. Please enjoy my conversation with Lora Cecere. Hi, Lora. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Lora, the first question of this podcast is always the same, and it is, does logistics matter?
Well, of course it does, right? Logistics is an important element of supply chain, and supply chain builds economies and hopefully will save the world if we can kind of get our act together. Logistics, of course, matters.
I like that answer. Thank you. And I understand that you talk about supply chain because your cup of tea, so to say, is way broader than just logistics. It is supply chain. You're actually known as the supply chain shaman. Where does that name come from?
Well, the shaman is supposed to be the character that helps us to drive insight, to drive excellence. But really, I was shifting jobs and I needed to start a blog and I had to find a URL that was available, and it was available. But I do hope that I provide insights and a different point of view for people. I write for the Business Innovator, which is very different than when I worked at Gartner Group, because when I was at Gartner Group, we wrote for the late stage IT adopter.
Mm-hmm.
So I try to really take more of a controversial point of view and try to help people to understand the art of the possible and, imagine, different outcomes with supply chain, because I find many people are quite stuck in their paradigms and their thinking about supply chain.
Yeah. It's supply chain and logistics is a very traditional industry.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me that it's become so iconoclast because, it's really relatively new. In 1982, the term supply chain to encompass make, source, and deliver was defined.
Yeah.
But suddenly we got a lot of stale thinking, and I don't understand why, but that's one of the things that I try to break down.
Yeah, great. And I think for sure you're living up to you're living up to your name. So what got you into supply chain? What happened? When did you wake up in the morning and say like, oh man, I'm just gonna go into supply chain?
Well, Martin, it's serendipity. My mother used to say, follow open doors. So I had a chemical engineering degree because, I liked being able to do things with molecules. And
Yeah.
I was recruited by Procter and Gamble to go into manufacturing. And there's nothing like opening the door of the factory in the morning and hearing the machinery and working with people. I loved manufacturing. It's just the cadence, the dynamics of manufacturing. But I liked building things and creating things. So I went into R&D and did new product launch for a while for Procter and Gamble. And my ex-husband, and the X is the operative word there, decided that he didn't really want to be in Ohio. So he found me a job at General Foods, which is now a division of Kraft. And I did new product launch for the business leader
Mm-hmm.
for the food division there. And we got into implementing technology and I sort of got into ran manufacturing for 15 years, was always on that project team with IT to put in technology, was always the gal that was pushing things to get better, and got recruited by a supply chain planning vendor and just kind of got propelled into the world. It's been, I think, a good learning activity as doors open. If you take them, you don't know where you're going, but you find yourself at 69, being the supply chain shaman.
I can't believe you are 69
Yeah, I am.
and still going strong.
Yeah, I hope to go strong for a long time.
Yeah, and then you see those like jokes on LinkedIn, like I'm in supply chain and I'm in logistics and I'm only 32, and then you see this picture of this I don't know 100-year-old person. Those apparently are jokes, because being in supply chain has not aged you.
Oh, well, I don't know. I used to travel about 200 days a year, and I don't travel like that anymore. Yeah, supply chain's been a great career for me.
So the last one of the last things read by you was on supply chain excellence, and that's a topic that I would definitely want to discuss with you. But before we go into supply chain excellence, what I'd like to ask you is to just take a look back at the recent years. And then, in light of supply chain excellence, what have been the developments that that are most significant for you in supply chain?
How far back do you want to go?
I guess, however far back makes sense in the light of what companies are missing when it comes to supply chain excellence. So there can be some items that you say, man, they have been doing this wrong since the 80s, or you're just saying, well, they need to make some shifts because of some recent developments.
Well, so let's go back in time to 1982 when we first started working on optimization in
Hmm.
supply chain. Our focus was on functional optimization. And that really spawned planning, whether it's transportation planning or manufacturing planning.
Yeah.
And at that point in time, we were dealing with 32-bit architectures, which only allowed us to do limited optimization. And
Hmm.
that defined the taxonomies of what we have today. Now, in parallel, we went from regional to multinational to global supply chains, and we tried to get economy of scale out of supply chain in that journey, and we did not get economy of scale. In fact, we don't see that mergers and acquisitions actually give us economies of scale either. And when I look at economies of scale, I'm really looking at cost, I'm looking at margin, I'm looking at growth, I'm looking at inventory. And actually, we carry 30 more days of inventory now than we did at the beginning of the recession in 2007.
Mm.
And so I think that, the issue is that we define supply chain excellence by functional metrics, things like lowest transportation cost, OEE, lowest manufacturing cost.
Yeah.
And that throws the supply chain out of balance because the supply chain is a complex, nonlinear system that really needs to be embraced in totality. And so I think that, when I was at AMR Research, which became Gartner, the work I did on the Gartner hierarchy of metrics is flawed because it defines supply chain as a function within other functions, not supply
Hmm.
chain as an overarching business strategy. So I think that our metrics really need to be focused on the intersection of growth, operating margin, inventory turns, asset, and customer service, not the functional metrics. And the good news is that our technologies today allow us to embrace a multidimensional, larger model that can tie to a balanced scorecard versus functional metrics. And that shift is extremely important because we don't have unified data models in supply chain. There's nothing in common, for example, between transportation management and distribution requirements. There's nothing in common between revenue management and demand management. And so, as we think more broadly around
Hmm.
managing balance sheets and we think more broadly around architectures, we can redefine the ability for an organization to reach supply chain excellence. But to do that, we must unlearn a lot of practices that are seen as best practices because they're not best practices. They throw the supply chain out of balance. In transportation, we're very fixated on route guides and first pass
Yeah.
tender. But, route guides are really based upon history, and first pass tender, we're not very reliable. So what if we went outside in for dynamic deployment and we held ourselves accountable for being a good trading partner, and we totally change how we think about logistics based upon market signals, not based upon history. And that's part of what I'm trying to achieve.
So, and we keep talking then about supply chain. And if I hear you correctly, then the whole term is actually wrong, because a chain is something linear, and you're saying that actually supply chains are not linear. So, are they? Is it more of a network or a matrix or a circle or what?
You know, I I'm not going to wordsmith and redefine terms, but I think that supply chain is a set of capabilities that help people to balance a balanced scorecard, and that it goes across source, make, and deliver, and that it allows bidirectional orchestration, of course, source, make, and deliver, to be able to drive better outcomes. Now, the problem is that as we invested in relational database technologies like
Hmm.
ERP and APS and TMS, we love those acronyms, right?
Yes.
We basically put all our data in data jails, and we lost the semantic layer, and we don't have a unified data model. And so, one of the advancements out of Web 2.0 that I think is very interesting is schema on read versus schema on write, and the ability to move to NoSQL and unified data models, and to be able to drive bidirectional orchestration to make trade offs across source, make, and deliver, which is a capability we don't have today, and to be able to do what if analysis on that. And that's actually part of what I'm trying to test with major supply chain planning vendors. But I may have gotten ahead of the conversation. So reel me back in and let's talk about what you think is interesting.
Well, but, just looking at, so you have mentioned a few things that you think are important when it comes to supply chain excellence. You went a little bit into the technology as well. So if you would define supply chain excellence, how would you define that? And also, is there a company of which you say those guys or those girls really get it, and that's supply chain excellence in action?
Yeah, unfortunately, there aren't a lot of girls. There's only about 30% women,
Yeah.
and not a lot of diversity, not a lot of people of color as well. And so, I am a strong advocate for diversity. Um, so let's talk about what is supply chain excellence. So I do this annual report called the Supply Chain Studmeyer, which we break companies into industry groups, because the
Yeah.
first thing you've got to do is you've got to define a peer group. And that's harder than it may sound. It took me about 4 years to divide them into peer groups, because things that are typically used in the industry, like SIC codes,
Hmm.
don't really help us to define like industries. So I worked with manufacturers and retailers to say, are you in the right group? And this methodology now is on its 11th year. And I worked with Arizona State University to say, what set of metrics drives the highest correlation to market capitalization and price to book? Because
Hmm.
I was trying to move us from a cost discussion to a value discussion. And I came up with, a balanced scorecard of growth, operating margin, inventory turns, return on invested capital. Would love to throw customer service in there, but there is no industry standard definition for customer service.
No.
So, you know, in a implementation, a company should use customer service. Now, those metrics are intertwined, and the goal of optimization should be to reach the balance of those metrics based upon the opportunity in the flow. The typical supply chain has 5 different flows.
Yeah.
It's got a very efficient supply chain, which is about 20 to 25% of the volume, which is very predictable, high volume. It's got a responsive supply chain, which is all about short cycles. Things like vaccines and seasonal and event products are all about time. And then
Hmm.
you've got the agile supply chain, which is about low volume, very lumpy demand products, and they require a different set of strategies. And then you've got what you're doing in your new product launch, your demand shaping activities, which, is an agile supply chain, but typically needs a little bit more design because you're typically working with third parties. And then the fifth supply chain is kind of cleaning up your mess. It's dealing with, things that slow and obsolete inventory,
Yeah.
returns, and managing, all of the loose ends. So as you design the supply chain, it's important to look at coefficient of variation and volume to be able to do the design. Now, Martin, only 9% of companies actually actively design the flows. Most companies
Mm.
will design an asset strategy, but not design the flows. And so each of these flows needs to be balanced against a scorecard, which goes across the organization. And one of the most important shifts to make is a movement from cost to margin, because cost only helps me with what's happening in the back office.
Yeah.
Margin helps me to understand the difference between shifting and shaping. Demand shaping looks at, am I increasing baseline lift? Whereas demand shifting will shift products from one time period to another without increasing baseline lift, and will demand shifting actually increase cost without driving growth. So these metrics going to a balanced scorecard is essential. And then when you do that, the functional metrics become all about reliability. So instead of looking at demand error, I look at forecast value add. Instead of looking at OEE, I look at schedule adherence and first pass yield. Instead of looking at the lowest transportation cost, I look at first pass tender and on time delivery. And
Mm.
these come up to a balanced scorecard. And, the companies that do this well are very aligned, and really very aligned organizationally and metrics to a balanced scorecard. So, who does this well? Well, in the supply chains to admire analysis, there are some companies that rise to the top that I never conceived would be doing it best about driving the balance scorecard at a balance sheet level.
Yeah.
Assa Abloy out of Sweden, Johnsonville Sausage in the States, Sleep Number in the States.
Hmm.
Uh, Rick and Kaiser does better than Procter and Gamble. Church and Dwight outperforms Colgate. And so when you look at these numbers, it's quite surprising which companies are really driving the biggest impact on the balance sheet. Does that make sense? I think I talked a lot. I'm
Mm.
sorry. Yeah.
No, 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 it does. So, and what differentiate these top players from their less performing counterparts?
Well, the interesting thing is you seldom see the top players speaking on a stage. So they're not spending as much time talking about how good they are.
Hmm.
They're more focused on, driving, real results. Uh, and what I find is the companies that are driving better results than their peer group on the balance sheet are very aligned on what matters at a strategic level. And I don't know if you read my recent blog around, most people start at process definition, not at strategy definition.
Yeah.
So to really drive balance sheet results, you've got to start at the strategy, and you've got to design those flows and the operating strategy, and then define process.
Yeah.
So they're good at defining a business strategy, taking it to an operating strategy, and aligning on that operating strategy, and aligning on a common set of metrics, versus the traditional global supply chain deployment pits functions against each other, manufacturing against transportation. And
Yeah.
if I have the lowest cost of manufacturing and I'm trying to have the lowest cost in transportation, those organizations will split,
Yeah.
because fundamentally what drives the lowest cost is not necessarily going to drive alignment. And
Yeah.
so the leader of those companies is very attuned with the need of metrics development to drive alignment and the need for clear definition of strategy.
And what they do is they focus on value and added value, and not on cost, which is the which is a lot of the times the well, it's even it's the way that logistics and supply chain are seen. So they are a cost. Where I always say it's where you can win and lose. So it's definitely not a cost. Yes, it costs money, but
Hmm.
it's what makes you the money in the end, because it's what gets you the product when it comes to supply chain, and it's what gets the product from A to B and to the end customer when you talk about logistics.
Right.
Yeah.
And, um, lots of people say, well, it's technology or it's a consulting firm. Uh, but I find that it's just really very much focused on who's the customer, what does the customer care about? And so many people aren't clear on that. What is the business strategy? How do I translate that business strategy and operating strategy? And how do I align source, make, and deliver to do that? And then how do I keep the alignment based upon the scorecard?
Yeah. And so what technological developments do you see? There could be recent ones, or maybe even you see, you have a crystal ball there. You see them in the future. Technological developments do you see that can help companies get to a supply chain excellence level? I mean, are we going to see supply chain GPT?
Oh, yeah, we'll see it, but will it be successful? Unless we define excellence, it won't be successful, right?
Yeah.
Too few people really are asking themselves the question of what defines excellence. And so as a result, we'll put in GPT into traditional optimization and really just put the organization on bad steroids, right?
Yeah.
And that won't help us at all. But let's talk about at the technology level. What I find very interesting is NoSQL and unstructured text mining and the building of outside in processes. I believe in 5 years, we will declare what we currently have as TMS and supply chain planning is obsolete because
Hmm.
it's inside out, it's not outside in. And so the
Okay.
evolution of signals in transportation, whether it's GPS or what's happening in the
Yeah.
cab, or our current transportation systems don't use that very well. It's very focused on history and traditional transportation processes. Same thing on the supply chain planning side. We're not using demand signals very well, and we're not really sensing and responding or reacting. So I think that, as we move from inside out to outside in, we are going to declare our current planning systems and our current thinking around planning and design to be obsolete. And I find that very exciting.
So what will we use then?
Well, we're going to use uh, scheme on read, we're going to sense, and we're going to respond. And we're going to have a unified data model across DRP and TMS, and we're going to drive bidirectional orchestration. So it's impossible for an organization today to make trade offs between transportation, manufacturing, and distribution. We do S&OP, we cast it in stone, sort of like concrete, and then we try to execute it. But the market changes. And how does an organization shift with the market? Uh, we don't have good answers. And I think this move in technology will help us to do that.
Um, Laura, thank you so far. I'd like to ask you one closing question. In the opening of the podcast, we were talking about if logistics matters, and you said that logistics and supply chain was going to save the world. Which, yeah, that sounds really good to me. So, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on your show. And I think it's really essential for supply chain leaders to put our shoulders back and take the challenge of how do we make things better. So, for example, food is so essential. And the question
Yeah.
is, will we have enough food to feed the population by 2050? And in 2050 isn't that long in the future as we think about our children.
Yeah.
But, agri-sciences actually have advanced to be able to drive 30% productivity improvements in the last 40 years on things like grain and foodstuff and dairy. And so, that's an example of a network that is really redesigned based upon science and molecules to be able to improve food and food value chains.
Mm-hmm.
And the only industry that has improved cost in the last decade is the food industry. If you look at
Oh,
the rest of the industries, we've pushed cost and waste back into the network, which
yeah.
has increased cost and increased waste. And so our investments in enterprise systems, as our sole focus, is an opportunity cost for us to be doing better things. Now, I'm an environmentalist. I spend a lot of time in my garden. I try to protect the monarch butterflies, etc. And if you look at
Nice.
environmental, you know, the supply chain, 77% of the environmental load from the supply chain comes in the network.
Yeah.
But we're not good at measuring that, and a lot of times people have these fancy documents, and they've got these great statements about ESG, and they're planting trees, and I don't think we have enough land to plant all the trees that we supposedly are
That you would
planting, right?
actually need. Yeah.
But if you look at supply chain, why do 40% of the trucks in the US roll empty?
Yes. What
We have
Europe in the Europe the same. Yeah.
we have no collaborative logistics, right? And why are we not looking at reverse trapping of hydrocarbons, which we're starting to do
Mm-hmm.
as a business to try to convert some of the hydrocarbons, right?
Yeah.
Why are companies not good trading partners, right? Why do we not have a trading partner index where a company that causes wait time or doesn't return containers or doesn't return the chassis is penalized?
Yeah.
Today we are a team sport with bad actors, and there's nothing that rewards good behavior. And so, if we're going to really take on the mantle of improving corporate social responsibility, we have to be good trading partners and we have to be a good owner of shared assets and logistics. And we need to put our money where our mouth is and rethink the processes of waste. So, for example, companies hold 30 days more inventory now than they did in 2007.
Yeah. Yeah.
That inventory is one of our biggest sources of waste. It fills warehouses. We have to run those warehouses with
Yep.
electricity. We've moved that product, we've converted those atoms, and look at how much of that goes to a landfill. The
Yeah.
management of inventory, which is often what is the byproduct of manufacturing logistics not being aligned, is a tremendous drag on the environment. And so I want us to put on our mantle to do things better, to, learn from the food industry about how networks can transform value chains, own our trading partner relationships, and to own our impact to the environment and come up with better ways. And I'm tired of the lip service. 92% of companies have these corporate social responsibility documents. People fly all around
Yeah.
the world talking about yada, yada, blah, blah, about what they're doing in the environment, but we're really not driving a difference outside in on collaborative logistics and looking at how do we do things better.
Yeah. Laura, I have nothing to add to that. I think you're absolutely right. So I hope what you wish that will happen, that companies see that we need to stop racing for the bottom when it comes to driving down cost, and that companies really start focusing on value and their own value, but also the value for the planet as a whole and the environment and the climate.
And
So
Martin, let me just end with
yeah,
a thought, okay? I'm
yeah,
a chemical engineer by background. In 1978, I got a chemical engineering degree, and I couldn't get a chemical engineering degree without two classes. One was on system thinking, and the second one was on design.
Yeah.
And I think everyone that is becoming a system thinker in supply chain, good for you. But the fact that only 9% of companies actively design their flows is abysmal. We cannot really drive corporate social responsibility without the design of the flows and without looking at what is the role of inventory, what is the role of each node, and how do I drive better outcomes outside in. And I think that's the challenge is let's stop talking about cash to cash and let's stop talking about lowest cost. Let's own the design. Let's design to the balance sheet. Let's embrace our networks. Let's build effective trading relationships and be good trading partners to drive better outcomes.
Lora, you absolutely 100% owned and nailed your supply chain shaman title. So thank you very much for your wisdom and for your look forward and for your hopes. And I hope you're right. And thank you very much. Thank you for listening to Does Logistics Matter? For more on trends and innovations in supply chain and logistics, visit our blog on logisticsmatter.com. If you want to be a guest on this podcast, please send an email to podcast@logisticsmatter.com. This podcast was produced by Dimitry VleugelThe. The music is based on a sample by Ragaman and produced by Michael Spengler. This episode was supported by Lora Cecere and Supply Chain Insights. Supply Chain Insights is focused on delivering independent, actionable, and objective advice for supply chain leaders, helping companies to find out which practices and technologies make the biggest difference to corporate performance. For more information, visit supplychaininsights.com and supplychainshaman.com.